Hi, my name's Dave Whitefield, and I help organisations tackle safety and risk primarily by helping them build cultural maturity by embracing risk. And in this slightly under 10-minute video, I'm going to talk about the culture paradox. And the culture paradox is just a way I help frame up this challenge of working on culture. But I also want to acknowledge that just the issue itself is a pretty debated one within health and safety. So there's a lot of chat at the moment, right? Is there such a thing as safety culture, or should it just be culture? Can you actually work on culture at all? Is it a thing that's just an artifact of other stuff? Or even does culture exist, right? These are all debatable ideas. And that's a worthy thing we should debate, right? We should get stuck into it and talk about the nature of these problems. And I think it makes sense when we, again, look at the idea that safety is a multidisciplinary industry. There's different paradigms at play. So if you've got a strong science or engineering focus, it makes sense that culture seems a little bit harder to work on, because culture does define measurement. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can sort of feel it, but that's a very qualitative outcome. And so it makes sense that in a science thinking point of view, is culture even a thing that you can do, right? If you've got a systems thinking approach, the most common or the most recent language I've heard there is sort of, yeah, sure, you can do culture work, but you do it through the system. So you change the system to influence the culture. Even in behavioral safety, I think where there's a reference to culture, what I most often hear is, well, you change the behavior to change the culture. Now, my paradigm, I use a social psychological paradigm to look at safety and risk and culture and people. I think that social psychology is well suited to it, because social psychology is fundamentally how people are influenced by the world around them. Except it's not the only one, and it should not be used in all situations, but it has a different view. So for me, for example, I see behavior as an outcome of culture, not the influencer of it. Of course, behavior still influences culture, but it's primarily the other way around. And so that's my view, and that's how I look at it, but I acknowledge the debate that's out there. I mean, is culture a thing? Look, it seems to be. It's talked about in nearly every major disaster review. A lot of leaders talk about it. It's talked about even within engineering philosophies. I've read some stuff recently about HOP, talking about just culture and safety culture. So it must be there. But I'll come back to this paradox issue. The paradox is, as I said, it's simply a way to frame up the conversation with leaders normally. But it's about saying, it's a paradox in that it's super easy to talk about and describe. I could go to anybody in the organization and say, what's culture like around here? And they will give me an answer. You need no academic knowledge, no technical knowledge, no understanding of human nature or psychology. You can say, it's great, it's loving, it's supporting, it's toxic, it's crap. You can describe it. And I think that ease of description fools us into thinking then that it's easy to define and talk about. And the issue is it's not. Like, if I ask that question of, well, what's the definition of culture? There's often this silence. And I do this in workshops, and what I tend to get is people saying what it should look like, so qualities of it. And sometimes people will give me shortened definitions, but they're different again, and they're from different models. Only the other day I had a conversation with a new client where they wanted to do culture work, so they understood the value of it. And that's, by the way, the work I tend to do is where organizations are wanting to work on safety and risk through people, and therefore I think culture is an appropriate tool and social psychology is an appropriate tool. If they want to do systems or behavioral or whatever other work, that's okay, but that's not my jam, right? So they wanted to do culture maturity work, and I said, well, what's your definition of culture that you're working on? And they were like, oh, that's a good question. I said, cool, well, that's all right, because that's the first thing we've got to tackle. And that's what I would put forward. The framing of a culture paradox is simply to say, what's next, right? And the argument of, even though it's easy to talk about, it doesn't mean it's easy to define. It means you've got to define it. To work on culture meaningfully and intentionally, my argument is you've got to have a common framework, model, or definition. You've got to have a grammar that allows you to talk about it. And when I say intentionally and meaningfully, every organization is, of course, working on culture. They're just often doing it unintentionally. For a long time, I've sort of had this standard response when organizations talk about, we want to get a safety culture. And this is a shout out to Brett Jones, who reminds me of this all the time. And my response, of course, is, well, you've got a safety culture. Do you mean you want a different one? So again, this depends on what your definition of culture is, but it exists. It's often unintentional. It's often derived at as an outcome of other work. And when it's managed that way, it might be unintentionally bad or negative. That's the problem. So if you want to intentionally work on it, you've got to use culture-specific strategies and an agreed grammar or framework. The issue is there isn't a single one. So this steps into the next sort of paradox, and in fact, why it's even more of a wicked problem that defies solution and can only be tackled. I use about 6 different models when I'm talking about safety and risk culture in organizations, and I use different concepts and ideas depending on the nature of culture. I don't sort of come in preloaded with them and go, but here they all are, but they're all worked in there in some way or another. Now I'm going to do a longer video breaking them down and talking about the pros and cons of them, but just as a little summary, I tend to use Edgar Schein's sort of definition of culture. He has a long one, and even I abbreviate that down, which is doing it disservice. But he, by the way, Edgar Schein, you might know from Humble Inquiry. So he talks about essentially sort of shared beliefs and assumptions learnt by groups that are then taught to others. He's also got a really good model around underlying assumptions, espoused beliefs, and artifacts. Great little model there. I use Dr. Rob Long's Culture as a Cloud. Fantastic metaphor, probably the best metaphor, I think, for all the different elements that coalesce and influence each other, and all the things, the ingredients of culture. Great for understanding subcultures. And also Rob's got a great diagnostic tool, the MyProfile tool. I use Hudson's Culture Maturity Spectrum. It's a really good one, well known. So it's got some visibility and some acceptance in industry. A lot of the language is out there, calculative, generative, etc. It's also great, to be really brutally honest. You put up a spectrum and ask leaders where they are now and where they want to be, and of course they want to be at the top. So it's a great sort of cognitive dissonance tool and a great way of labeling where you are. I use the Competing Values Framework, which is outside of safety. It's by Cameron and Quinn, really good for understanding the sort of power and the dynamics that are at play within an organization, and why when you do this and add more bureaucracy, it could create problems with empowerment. Just helps understand that. It is a pretty complex one, but it helps understand that. And I also use Carl Veek's essentially organizational mindfulness model. Now, that might sound out there, but it's actually the HRO model. So high reliability organizations, or HROs, that work and the 5 elements of a HRO actually came from Carl Veek's work. And he's a social psychologist. So it's actually a social psychological paradigm around how organizations can be mindful. There are 5 elements, which are the 5 elements of a HRO. I see them as being organizational traits or cultural features. They're not systems or things you do, they're traits of the organization, but that's the way I look at that. And I also include that in my work. And the final model is, I'm wary of saying this, but it's a sort of a framework that I've developed that is clearly based in all this other work, but it's about a sort of a scaffolding, if you will. And this is my Embracing Risk framework, which is just language that I use to define it and differentiate it from other models. But it's about scaffolding organizations through a series of steps. It is heavily based in Cameron and Quinn's work and Rob Long's work, but it's a series of steps that scaffold organizations into culture maturity. It tackles some of the existing problems in safety we've got right now to shift it, because things like we say stop measuring safety through harm, but we can't let go of it. So there's got to be something else instead, and that's what this work is about. I'm still working on that model. I'm up to version 3. Still holding a lot of uncertainty about whether it's got merit or not, but that's where I'm at the moment. So culture is a paradox. It's easy to talk about, yet difficult to define. But if organizations want to work on it, they need to have some sort of working definition, and then they need to use culture-specific tools and strategies. And all I'm getting at there is there are different tools for different problems. Systems, guarding, measurement, hygiene, analytics, they've all got different tools, right? Well, you need culture-specific stuff if you're doing culture work, which is more through people, leadership, language, stories, learning, engagement. They're different strategies and it's a different capability that you need as well. And that's part of that Embracing Risk framework. So thank you very much for listening this far. Open to any input, feedback, good, bad, or otherwise. And as I said, keep a lookout for the next video. Thanks, everyone.